Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMind Factory. In this short video, I would like to show you how to use fine-grained authorization provided by Auth0. So let's start. Before we start, a small disclaimer. At the moment of recording this video, Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization is in a developer community preview. Perfect. So let me start with the example. In a typical scenario, we can have multiple front-end apps, multiple back-end apps, and those applications can be secured by identity providers. And when I say identity provider, I have Auth0 on mind. It can be Azure AD, Azure AD B2C, and some other identity providers. And now, before I can access Web API, so as a user, I have to sign in the front-end application. And what's happening underneath, I'm clicking login button in the front-end application. I'm redirected to the identity provider authorized endpoint, and there I can provide my credentials, and after that I'm redirected back to the front-end application with the ID token, which is for my front-end application to identify myself and to know my basic profile data, but also during this communication with authorization server and identity provider, I can ask to obtain access token, which I can use to call a specific web API on behalf of authenticated user in the front-end application. So when I want to call this web API, of course, I need to attach the authorization header with the token, access token that I obtained. But the case is that there can be scenario where I want to implement fine-grained authorization on the API side. So let me put an example. Let's say that there is a clinic called Cloud Pharmacy, and there are doctors, there are patients, and those different people can have different permissions in a specific scope. So when I access Web API as a patient, let's say, I want to have access to prescriptions, I want to be able to display them, but for instance, I should not have permission to edit those prescriptions, because this permission should be assigned only to doctors. And of course you can say that, okay, Daniel, so we can use scopes. So in this case, I can request access token with a specific scope, and this scope will be presented as claim inside the access token. And once the access token is sent to the Web API can validate the scope, can see, like, for instance, that there is a permission called write. So it means that this specific user can edit or write prescription. But this is not the case here. This is not real authorization and fine-grained authorization in this case. And please, I really encourage you to check the article that is referenced in this video description, which is written by Vittorio Bertocci, where he explains why we shouldn't mix scopes and permissions. So scope is not permission when it comes to access tokens. So in this case, you can say, okay, but we could request multiple scopes and then Web API can validate those scopes. Okay, fine, but there are a few issues with this approach. One of them is the size of the access token. If you want to put a lot of different permissions as scopes within the access token, those tokens will be really large. And on the other side, you can have situation where you have different authorization model per different APIs, let's say. So in this case, it's better to handle authorization and permissions on the API side, on the backend side, and not to use permissions as scopes within the access token. And in this video, I would like to show you how to use Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization, which enables you to define your authorization model and authorization data and verify permissions on the backend side or in the web application, but to be sure that you don't have to use scopes as permissions in the access tokens anymore. So let's start. So this is Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization dashboard. It's available under dashboard.fga.dev. And as you can see, there are basically 4 steps. And this will be like a simple overview of this fine-grained authorization mechanism. So first of all, we have to define our authorization model. So to do it, we use Model Explorer view to define our authorization model, which allows us to specify the types of the objects in our application and the relationship between them. And I want to show you that just in a minute. So once we define the authorization model, so those different objects and relationships, we can then add authorization data to our store. So in this case, we can define that, okay, this specific user in my solution will have this relationship when it comes to this specific object. And of course, we have to, and we want to validate those different relationships using assertions. And once we have everything verified, we can then connect our application to the authorization store. So let's start with Model Explorer. So this is the place where we can basically define our authorization model. As you can see, I created a really simple authorization model. I have 2 types, prescription and clinic. So when it comes to relationship with prescription, we have 2 relations. We have reader and writer. So someone can read and display prescription and someone can write it, create it. So in this case, it's about doctors and about patients. And I have also this type clinic and relations like doctor and patient. So within my clinic, I have doctors, and I have patients. And on the right side, there is a preview. So you can see that when it comes to prescription, I have those 2 assignable relations, reader and writer. And when it comes to the clinic, there is also this relation between doctor and patient. And once I have it, I can go to the Getting Started tab once again. And as a second step, I can add authorization data. So now I can start writing authorization data to my store in Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization. In this case, I have to click Navigate to Tuple Management, and this is the place where I can define those different relationships between different objects and users. So let me show you how it works. As you can see on the left side, I have those 3 properties, let's call them like this, so user, object, and relation. So under the user, I use the object ID, so the unique identifier of the user from my identity provider. In the demo application, which I will show you in a minute, I use Azure Active Directory B2C as identity provider. So it's very important to mention that you don't have to use Auth0 to integrate with Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization. In this case, you can use any identity provider. So under the tuples, I'm defining this relationship. So this specific user is in a relation as doctor to the object, which is cloud pharmacy. So in a simple words, this specific user is doctor in my cloud pharmacy clinic. Under this tuple, I have another tuple with different user ID, and I see that this user is patient in my cloud pharmacy clinic. So again, I have the user property, which is unique ID of the user. I have object, so clinic, cloud pharmacy, and I have this relation, patient. And below that, I have again the ID of the patient in this case, and I see that patient can read this specific prescription. And the same is about, and the same, quite the same definition is for the doctor, so which is the last tuple here. So the doctor can write prescriptions. So doctor can create them. So in this case, I have those 4 tuples. So I define that this person is patient, this specific person is doctor in my clinic, and patient can read prescription and the doctor can write prescriptions. And this is just only simple example. So now let me show you how to use the query tool. In the query tool, I can write this human readable query. So is this specific user, so in this case I'm using the object ID, so unique identifier of the user, is this specific user related to prescription object with this specific ID as writer? So let's see. After a few seconds, I can see that this specific user, which is doctor in my cloud pharmacy clinic, this specific user can write prescriptions. But now, if I will change the ID of the user to be the ID of the patient, here, let me do it really quickly, and I will play, you can see that this specific patient is not related to this specific prescription as writer. So patient cannot write prescriptions. Okay, perfect. So now let's get back to the Getting Started tab. And now let's talk about the third step, so writing assertions. So we can write and use assertions to make sure that our authorization model works as expected. So once I click Navigate to Assertions here, you can see that in this place, I have again my model of authorization, I have my tuples, and on the right side, there are assertions. As you can see, I wrote 3 assertions, and I can write them clicking Add Assertion here. And here I can define the user, object, and relation. And once I do it, it will be displayed here in this column called Assertions. And as you can see, I define 3 assertions. So first of all, I want to make sure that specific doctor can write specific prescription. So there is writer relationship. I want to be sure that a specific patient cannot write specific prescription. And in the end, I want to make sure that the patient can display specific prescription because there is reader relationship. So once I define those assertions, I can click Run All. I can also run one of them using Run Selected. And you can see that 3 assertions passed and 0 failed. So in this case, my authorization model and data, everything is implemented as expected. Perfect. So right now, if we get back to the Getting Started tab, there is a 4th step, Connect to your application. So this is the place here where we have to generate the API credentials. We have to integrate with Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization. So to do it, I provided helpful links in this video description. So I really encourage you to check them so you can easily integrate your application with Fine Grained Authorization. There is also this great article referenced in this video where you can read more about Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization, developer preview release. So I encourage you to do it. This is the sample application I created. As I mentioned before, I use Azure AD B2C as an identity provider here. And this application is also integrated with Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization. So once I provide my credentials, I can click Sign In. And after a few seconds, I'm redirected back to this demo application. And I can click Prescriptions section. And as you can see, there is a small prescription image. So I can either display it in a full screen or I should be able to edit it. And this is where Fine Grained Authorization comes to play. So I signed in as a patient. So of course, as you remember, I do not have a writer permission here. So if I will click Edit this prescription, after a few seconds, there is this notification that I cannot modify prescription because I do not have writer permission. But if I want to display it, this specific prescription, I can click Display button, and now I have this information that I can successfully display this prescription because I have reader permission. So right now, let's jump into the code to see what's happening underneath. This is the source code of my web application, which is integrated with Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization. You can find it on my GitHub under the link currently displayed on the screen. Okay, so what's happening in the source code? Integration with Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization is implemented using HTTP requests and responses, so there is no magic here. So let me show you that. I have this FGA authorization handler class, and inside this handler class I have three variables: HTTP client, context, and configuration. So if we scroll down, first of all, we have to obtain the access token to be able to communicate with Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization API. So in my appsettings.json file, I provided all required configuration parameters like client ID, client secret, audience, and grant type, which is client credentials. And then I can successfully call Fine Grained Authorization API to obtain the access token. Once I have this access token, I can access my authorization data and model. So if we scroll up, there is another method implemented, check if action allowed async. So inside this method, I have to pass the relation here, so reader or writer, and it's simplified of course. But once I provide it, then I have to get the user ID from the HTTP context. So in this case, once I am authenticated, I can get the object ID, so a unique identifier of the user from the ID token. And once I have this user ID, I can create verification request. So in this case, we have the tuple key instance, and here I'm providing the object, which is the prescription with this specific ID, P1234, relation here, so relation will be provided as a parameter in this method, so reader or writer, and the user, so the user ID, which is unique identifier from my identity provider, which is Azure AD B2C. So now, if I open the fetch data page, you can see that I'm injecting FGA authorization handler at the top of the page. And then if we scroll down, here is the image with prescription and two buttons. The first one is to display prescription, and the second one is to edit prescription. So when I click display prescription button, the display prescription async method is executed and invoked, and FGA authorization handler check if action allowed async method is invoked with the reader relation. So in this case, I want to check whether this specific user has the reader permission and is in the reader relationship to this specific prescription. And once I receive the response from the Fine Grained Authorization API, I can check whether it's true or false. So it's Boolean value returned here. So I can just check true, false value. So if I can read prescription, there will be notification message displayed with success severity. But when I try to edit the same prescription by clicking Edit Prescription button, I will call FGA authorization handler, check if action allowed async method with the writer parameter, and then I will verify whether this specific user with this specific user ID has writer permission. So is in a relationship to prescription with the writer permission. So in this case, if I cannot edit prescription, so the response from the FGA API will be false, I will display error message. You cannot modify prescription, you do not have writer permission. This was just a basic example how to integrate with Auth0 Fine Grained Authorization API. I encourage you to visit official documentation where you can find more details about the Fine Grained Authorization store provided by Auth0 and what are the integration options. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting and helpful. If you like my videos, please subscribe because this will be the sign for me to produce more videos. See you in the next video.